Director of the Irish American Heritage Center. I just wanted to say that you're all very welcome here this afternoon in our panel discussion, A View into the Irish Economy. We have a great deal of intellectual horsepower up on stage here this afternoon, so I want to jump right into the program. But first want to just quickly thank our co-sponsors for today, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Ireland Network, particularly Niamh King and Helen Garrity, for your support. Also wanted to quickly introduce our panelists today, as well as our moderator, Mr. Tom Wright. First panelist is Mr. Peter Schiff. Peter's the president of Bureau Pacific Capital, an investment management firm out of Connecticut. Peter's the author of the best-selling books Crash Proof 2.0, How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse, and How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes. Peter makes regular appearances on CNBC, Fox Business, and CNN. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show. He headlined an economics festival in Ireland in November called Kilkenomics, and is widely credited for having predicted the dot-com bubble collapse and the credit crisis with precision. Next up, Mr. David Lynch. David's a senior writer for Bloomberg. He's the author of the new book, When the Luck of the Irish Ran Out. Before Bloomberg, David was the founding bureau chief for the USA Today in both London and Beijing. He was awarded an Eban Fellowship at Harvard and has a master's degree in international relations from Yale University. Next up is Mr. Martin Ruine. Martin is the Consul General of Ireland here in Chicago. He's been in the Foreign Service for Ireland for the past 40 years. Martin was recently a distinguished speaker at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business European Conference. And last but certainly not least, Mr. John Gleason. John's a senior lecturer in ethnic studies and director of the Celtic Studies program at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. John also manages the Irish Immigrant Service in Milwaukee. He's lectured extensively on Ireland. He's a regular consultant and contributor to print and broadcast media on Irish issues. He's also well known within the Irish community as a speaker and cultural activist. And then our moderator for today, Mr. Tom Wright. Tom's the Executive Director of Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He also lectures in U.S. National Security Policy at the Harris School for Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Tom earned his doctorate from Georgetown in 2007, was awarded a pre-doctoral fellowship at Harvard and a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University. His work has appeared in the American Political Science Review, the Washington Quarterly, Survival, Orbis, Prospect Magazine, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune, the Diplomat, and a number of international newspapers and media outlets. I'll turn you over to him now. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tom Wright.
Tim, thank you so much for that, for those introductions. I think I can speak on behalf of the panel and say we are delighted to be here today for this discussion. We really do live in some extraordinary and worrying times. When I was back in Ireland a few months ago, I was surprised that everybody in bars and pubs are talking about basis points and subordinated debt and senior debt and knew the differences between all of these things. And I just thought that if the objective of government policy was to increase financial literacy, that certainly happened over the last 2 years, although at a high cost. So we have a lot on the table here today, including the cultural side, how we got into this. But I thought I'd start off with a question that I think is in everyone's mind, which is basically, does the Irish economy have a future? Or is it facing into a decade, a sort of a lost decade of recession and reversal? And Martin, I thought I would start with you on that question, because you have been the Consul General here in Chicago. You deal every day and every week with businesses and policymakers trying to convince them to invest in Ireland, or that the future of the economy is, I guess, sad. So how do you see things, and does the Irish economy have a future?
Thank you very much, and if I might echo the comments earlier on, that I think it's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to talk about the Irish economy, and to try and perhaps put a bit of perspective on some of the issues that we've been listening to over the last while. The first thing that I would like to say is just let's get a bit of perspective Ireland and the size of Ireland. Ireland is a very small country. It's got a population of about less than 4.5 million people, significantly less than the population of the Greater Chicago area. Our territory is a little bit bigger than the Greater Chicago area, but nonetheless, we are talking about, in global economic terms, a very small economic unit. We have a very open economy. We have developed over the years a reliance on trade. Trade as a means to build our economy and to position ourselves in the world community, both politically and economically. We've put a lot of effort into attracting international business into our country. I'm sorry if I may sound that I'm avoiding the question, but I think the best way I could go about answering the direct question is if you could bear with me, if I could read a little bit from an op-ed piece that the Chief Executive of Enterprise Ireland wrote recently. I promise not to go, if I'm going too long, please let me know and I can cut this back a bit. But over the last 24 months, developments in Ireland have diminished our international reputation, and consequently, international commentary on Ireland has been largely negative in focus. In the prevailing doom and gloom, important stories, such as the growing success of Irish companies in worldwide markets, are going untold or ignored both in domestic and international discourse on Ireland. The international picture of Ireland is more complete and skewed. We in Ireland have a strong story to tell. Ireland's best days lie ahead of us, not behind us. We have built a modern, dynamic economy. We're more experienced than ever and more capable than ever. Irish companies are selling innovative, advanced products and services all over the world. Ireland can be the comeback economy of Europe. Allowing for certain hyperbole in certain situations, but the sentiment is still nonetheless there. As an open economy, export success is fundamental to Ireland's economic recovery, and in terms of exports, Ireland is already showing a strong rebound from the recession of 2009. 70% of the exports lost in 2009 were recovered in 2010. By the end of 2011, we expect exports to be above our record pre-recession levels. Because of the work we've put into as a nation, Ireland continues to punch well above its weight globally. We're the largest net exporter of pharmaceuticals in the world. We're the world's second largest exporter of computer and IT services in the world, behind India and ahead of Germany, the UK and the USA. We're the fifth largest exporter of beef in the world. Globally, 1 in 7 formula-fed babies are drinking infant formula that has been produced in Ireland. And in financial services, 1.7 trillion euros of funds are administered from Ireland. The value of Irish exports is greater than the value of the exports of Australia and Brazil. For a small island, these are fairly impressive achievements. Irish innovation is now truly global. When you travel to the US, you'll have your eyes and fingerprints scanned by US immigration. That technology belongs to an Irish company, Daon. If you undergo a medical procedure anywhere in the world in which a stent is implanted in your body, there's an 80% probability that this is Irish technology. And we also have Irish financial services dealing with some 90 billion of payments all over the world. The diversified industrial landscape that we have built over several years in Ireland hasn't gone away. And I think this is very important because a lot of people are looking to the cycle of recession that we've had, and we've had some fairly serious ones, but this one is going back a number of years, but not back to where we were at our worst moment. We have a strong cohort of indigenous indigenous Irish companies exporting to wider international markets than in any other time in the history of the state. More Irish companies are engaged in research and development. The IDA has been hugely successful in attracting foreign direct investments into Ireland, and this is one of our cornerstones of how we've built and we plan to continue building the Irish economy. And there have been so many points of discussion about our strategy in this respect, and question marks raised about our corporation rate of tax. This is an important cornerstone for Ireland. This 12.5% rate of tax is central to how we've developed our economy, and it will remain so. This has been reinforced by successive governments, and I see no basis, despite the various commentaries in public, of any change in that respect. On the education front, more of our people are more educated now than at any other time, and there are more Irish businessmen and businesswomen with international experience than ever before. Ireland remains high in international rankings as a place to do business. World Competitive Yearbook ranks Ireland as first for corporate taxes and fourth for having a culture that is open to new ideas. We are fourth in the world for availability of skilled labour and sixth in the world for labour productivity. And I think this whole question of productivity is also a new and emerging issue that we have to be very conscious of, and that is that since the recession, prices have, labour has gone back down. We are now more competitive than we were before, and we are more open and competitive in obtaining inward investment. Ireland is a positive story to tell, and this is the side that the international community is sometimes missing. Now, I'm just going to finish off with one quote, and someone once said that Seamus Heaney is so often quoted that he should be getting rights from the Irish government. But this one is particularly appropriate, I think. On his 70th birthday in April 2009, he said that we should keep our feet on the ground to signify that nothing is beneath us, but we should also lift up our eyes to say that nothing is beyond us. On that note, I would like to finish and say that yes, I think there is hope for the Irish economy. We will continue to work both in our own individual efforts to attract industry into us and also to help our trade efforts. But fundamentally, we will work within Europe. We are part of Europe. We're part of the Eurozone, and this is a political and economic experiment that has had very amazing impact in Europe. We've redrawn the map of Europe, we have redrawn allegiances within Europe, and we have developed a way to do business in a collaborative way, seeking consensus. I see that as the way forward, and I'm sorry if I took too much of your time.
Thank you, Martin. Peter, could I turn to you now? And Martin's given a sort of a glass half full, optimistic picture. You're a very successful and well-known investor who deals a lot with international economies. As you look at it, does the Irish economy have a future, and what does this new government need to do to turn things around?
Well, first they have to, of course, have a future. The question is, what's that future going to look like? And you have to understand the real source of the problems in Ireland, and they're similar to the sources of the problems in the U.S. And of course, the Irish government made many of the same mistakes our government made, and so we're going to be in a similar position to Ireland very, very soon, maybe probably worse. But what happened in Ireland is, you had a housing bubble for many of the same reasons we had one here. Interest rates were much too low around the world. Why were they so low? They were very low because we had rates low. The U.S. moved interest rates down very low during the Greenspan tenure. And because the dollar was the reserve currency, low interest rates in the U.S. meant low interest rates everywhere. We corrupted the monetary policy of the entire planet, so low interest rates spawned the fuel for the housing bubble. And also in Europe, what happened is when you had monetary union, a lot of the investors suddenly were not drawing a distinction between German government debt or Irish government debt or Greek government debt, because it was all in the euro, and the assumption was, well, it's all the same. Of course, it wasn't the same, and the rates were never identical. German credit was always less expensive than maybe Greek credit, but the spreads were much lower than they had been when the Greeks had the drachma and the Irish had the plunge. And so that brought interest rates down even more in Europe. And with housing prices rising in much of the world, not all of the world, but certainly in a lot of the English-speaking nations, and as housing prices started to rise, a lot of credit too, got moved in there, and a lot of the fund managers or investors were chasing yield, and they were, they could get a little extra yield, loaning money on real estate that they could, buying sovereign debt. So a lot of money went in there, and in many ways, Ireland was a victim of its own success because the Irish economy was doing well, because they had lower taxes and reduced government. So a lot of people just assumed that it was a good risk loaning to the Irish. A lot of people, Irish people, were borrowing money from all around the world. I mean, not only were the Irish banks loaning money on real estate, but banks all over Europe were loaning, even American banks were loaning money. And there was a huge real estate movement. That was a big misallocation of resources, of productive capacity that was funneled into the housing market that, absent that cheap money and absent that speculative mania, that never would have happened. And when the housing bubble burst, a lot of people should have lost a lot of money. But Irish politicians didn't want that to happen. So instead of letting banks like Anglo-Irish Bank fail, and letting the creditors of that bank lose money, and instead of letting the creditors of all the European banks that had foolishly loaned money to real estate speculators in Ireland, instead of doing that, the Irish government made the mistake of guaranteeing the debt of Irish banks. Now, why did they do that? Well, they did that for the same reason that politicians always do things. If they had not guaranteed the debt, there would have been a crisis right then and there. And so what they did is they acted politically expediently, and they said, well, what can we do to postpone the crisis? Well, let's just guarantee the debt. And by doing that, then they were able to postpone it, but at a huge cost. You see, if the Irish government hadn't guaranteed the debt, there would have been a lot of losses. A lot of those losses would have not taken place in Ireland. They would have taken place in Germany. The people that loaned the money would have lost. And people need to be held accountable in capitalism. When you make a loan, and there's a good chance that you won't get your money back. And there's been a lot of complacency around the world to the idea that governments will always bail people out. People who loaned money to Irish real estate speculators, they got paid interest. They got paid a higher rate of return than they would have got had they invested more conservatively. They knew the risks. Maybe they didn't understand the risks, but they assumed the risk for the reward, and they should have been allowed to suffer the losses. But they didn't. The Irish government assumed the losses. Now, probably the Irish government didn't understand how big the losses were going to be. They probably got bad information from the people who looked at the market, so they bit off a lot more than they could chew. But the real problem for the Irish economy now is the debt that exists because of the government bailout. That is the real problem. And the greater problem is, what type of changes might the European Union demand that Ireland undertake as a condition for more bailouts and more loans? Because there's no way Ireland can pay back this money. It's not even possible. I think the per capita, I read a number, this is the gross foreign debt per capita in Ireland is the highest in the world. It's about $500 million per Irishman. Now, I'm not sure what the net is if you offset that by the Irish assets, but it's a staggering amount of money. And to try to extract that from the Irish economy, I mean, there can be much higher taxes. They might force them to raise the corporate income tax, raise the personal income tax. Also, they could pay back money to the European banks or the American banks that loan money. What Ireland needs to do is recognize that guaranteeing that debt was a mistake, and they should repudiate it. the Irish taxpayers should not stand behind these obligations. It doesn't make any sense. People need to be able to lose money. And Ireland, you know, they shouldn't want any bailouts from Europe. They don't need any bailouts. Just don't pay back the money. You know, let the creditors, you know, if there's assets there, fine. But the taxpayers shouldn't be behind it. And the market needs to be allowed to sort out the imbalances that were caused by the real estate boom. And then, you know, debts will be liquidated and assets will change hands, and the Irish economy can prosper. But if Ireland is going to be like a debt slave, and they're going to try to keep these promises that never should have been made in the first, so what? So the bankers and European bankers can be made whole on loans that they shouldn't have made. And I think even a bigger damage is being done to the euro, because I think the credibility of the euro is at risk. And because if there's going to be this idea that any government that fails is going to be bailed out by the European Union, then the euro is no better than the dollar. And then the moral hazards are immense that you set off for all of Europe, because you've got a lot of people in Germany that are going to say, look, you know, why are we bailing out? Why are we paying our tax dollars to bail out another country that has a lot of debt? You have a moral hazard, and it encourages other nations to run debt. And you send a message to creditors, just loan money recklessly to governments, because you can't lose. Because if the government doesn't pay you back, there'll be a bailout, or they'll print the money. We need creditors to understand that loans are risky. That when you loan money to a sovereign, that you might not get the money back. If they borrow more than the taxpayers can realistically pay, you're not going to get your money back. And if the lenders are nervous about sovereign credit, they won't lend them that much money. And if they don't lend them that much money, they can't borrow it. See, everybody seems to think it's great that governments can borrow money. It's not great, it's terrible. Because the people have to pay it back. They have to pay it back with interest. And if the creditors knew that, if the creditors appreciated that, they would think twice before lending money to politicians, and then politicians couldn't spend so much money. But I think one of the reasons that they want to bail out in Ireland is because all these big governments are in debt, and they don't want anybody worried. They want to pretend that all of this debt can be repaid when it can't. And you know, when I was down there in Ireland for that economics, and you look at all the people that were poor average Irishmen that are being asked to pay this bill, and there's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of what's happening. And a lot of it ends up getting blamed on capitalism, getting blamed on freedom, because you have a situation where Ireland had all these free market reforms, which were great, and now they have this major crisis, which was not the result of the free market, but central banking, and now they have all this debt because the government socialized it. But now the people are going to be blaming capitalism and the free market, and it creates a very bad climate going forward within Ireland politically. So I think, as I said earlier, they can solve these problems if they just will admit that they can't pay this money back. And now, I don't know if they can draw a distinction between the Irish government debt that existed prior and this new debt that's been accumulated, or the bank loans that they have guaranteed. But they have to withdraw those guarantees. And if they do that, they don't need any aid. They don't need any bailouts, because then you have manageable debt. I mean, that's what has to happen when you have too much money. And the creditors might not get zero. They might get 50 cents on the dollar or 40 cents on the dollar. But a lot of people lost a lot more than that in the credit collapse. So the fact that if they get anything, they're better off than getting nothing. But you can't try to hold 4.5 million people responsible for repaying this debt, because I think the damage to the economy would be immeasurable, and to the progress that Ireland was making before this crisis happened.
Peter, thank you. We will want to certainly come back to the question of how you would sort of default or restructure the debt, I think, and on the practical political problem of how to convince Ireland's European partners to succeed in that. But I think we'll save that for a few minutes. I'd like to turn to David. You wrote a fascinating book which I read over the last few days. On the luck that the Irish ran out, that really takes a pretty hard, takes the political process in Ireland to task for the mistakes that they made. And what we heard sort of from Peter was that it was low interest rates, it was structural, it was to do with currency, From how you look at it, I mean, was it also human errors or political errors? And after this election that occurred a couple of weeks ago, there's a lot of hope for political reform. And some of those mistakes, the causes of those mistakes will be removed and new structures will be put in place. Are you hopeful, or do you think it's a false start?
Yeah, I agree with some of what I've heard. First, let me say, you know, I don't think it makes sense to either deny the seriousness of the hole that Ireland has dug for itself or to exaggerate it. The country has, at the end of an extraordinary period that really transformed all aspects of Irish life, the country is sort of light years away from where it was in the mid-'80s, where I started my story. At the end of that period of genuine growth, genuine change, genuine reform and prosperity, things veered dramatically and tragically off the rails. You can find failure in both the public and private sector at this point. And at this late stage of the game, I think it's safe to say that every institution in Ireland, every elite institution has been discredited by its performance. If you take a snapshot of Irish life today, whether it's the banks, the government, the church, the media, business, they all hang their heads. Nobody has much to be proud of at this point. But the election that we've just seen, I think, if you are a hopeful mind, does offer the prospect of turning the page. We've had 3 years now of recrimination, and much of it justified. But I was in Ireland this past weekend, and while the public anger is still there, it's still incandescent at the predicament that the country finds itself in, people are also desperate for an idea of the path forward, because they don't want to marinate in their unhappiness. My concern as an outsider looking at the political class is that one of the things that's always been striking about Ireland's political structure is that the principal cleavage between the two main parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, dates back to the Civil War of the early 1920s. It's not the standard sort of left-right split that you would see in a European parliamentary democracy, or even here in the United States, where if two guys walk in or two gals walk in, and one's from the Republican Party and one's from the Democratic Party, you've probably got a fair idea of their positions on a half a dozen of the major issues that face the country. You know where they stand, you know what you get if you vote for a Republican, you know what you get by and large if you vote for a Democrat. In Ireland, at least to an outsider, you know, I can't tell a Fine Gael politician from a Fianna Fáil politician. And near as I can tell, Fianna Fáil's entire ideology for 80 years has centered on getting power, holding power, and executing power. And so now that they're out of power, I'm not clear on what they believe at all. Getting it back, perhaps, exactly. But Fine Gael is, to my mind, a little better. They distinguished themselves during the insanity of the past 10 years by clamoring for even more of the policies that got the country into this mess. Fianna Fáil had lunatic tax breaks that encouraged war building at a time when housing and construction was already roaring along unaided, policies that led to the creation of housing estates, housing developments, literally out in the middle of nowhere where no one wants to live. Those houses are vacant to this day and may end up being bulldozed. Fine Gael wanted more of that. They criticized the government for not doing enough to promote construction. So my optimism is measured. The thing that I also find interesting is if you think of the political tumult that we've had in this country as a response to the Bush and then Obama policies that bailed out the banks, the TARP program, the one package of bailouts, $700 billion. As a share of the economy, in other words, measured against the size of the economy, the Irish government's response to the financial crisis crisis, to recapitalizing the banks and repairing the damage, has been the equivalent of 7 TARP programs. Now, one TARP program gave birth to the Tea Party here, that whatever you think of the Tea Party's policies, has fundamentally shaken American politics. And yet in Ireland, you had a tab, a fiscal tab, if you will, that's been 7 times as great. And the political response, to my mind, yes, Fianna Fáil has been justifiably kicked to the curb, but that's been about it. It's been a fairly measured, or muted, I should say, response. Now, the new government is talking about political reform, and certainly there's a long list of things that need to be done. But I was struck, again, having just been there this weekend, one of the main reform planks going forward is to shrink the size of the public sector, is to cut the sort of ludicrous overspending that's gone on. You know, the head of the Irish Central Bank in recent years had a salary that was a multiple of Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke's salary, and the Irish Central Bank doesn't even control interest rates. Those are controlled in Frankfurt. The Taoiseach gets a salary that's higher than the American president, and last time I looked, the Taoiseach doesn't have any nuclear weapons. Well, the first step that the new government is taking to try and reform the public sector is to create a new ministry of public sector reform. So, presumably with a staff that will write up reports and go about doing that. Now, having said that, to end on an optimistic note, and I sort of went out of my way to end my book on an optimistic note, which is against my character. But, you know, I interviewed this legendary Irish civil servant and public figure, T.K. Whitaker, who was born in the year of 1960. And RTE, a couple of years ago, named him the greatest living Irishman in the 20th century. He's really an extraordinary figure. Civil servants, at their best, in a country like Ireland, have a profile, a place in governance that is really sort of well known in the United States. But Whitaker, over the years, had been absolutely instrumental in the 1950s in helping or encouraging or forcing the government to turn away from its failed protectionist policies and embrace trade. And he had been president of the National University and been the head of the central bank. And I sat with him in his home and asked him to sort of reflect on what had gone wrong and what might yet come. And to paraphrase, he said, you know, we've made our share of mistakes. We've made maybe more than our share of mistakes. But at every turn, we've shown that we can learn from our errors, make the necessary adjustments, and head out on the right path. And so I think if you take the long view of Irish history, you do have some reason for optimism.
Thank you. John, looking at the long view of Irish history, we know from Ireland's history, but also from the history of any country, that its culture, it's largely, defined by certain sort of key moments. I mean, for many countries that's independence, but also in Ireland's case, the trouble of the 1950s, the troubles in Northern Ireland, all of these episodes have a long term sort of cultural impact. And what do you think the cultural impact of this period that we're still currently experiencing will be?
Tim, Díodh when you shall Tránóna, Jazz, an Shaw, Egan, Diaspora, Solo, Atar, Ashur, Anshaw. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's delightful to be here. I think one of the things that concerns me is the impact of the Celtic Tiger years on the Irish psyche. The Irish were always great at coping. I remember Mary Robinson, when she was president, and she was talking about the anniversary of the famine in Ireland, and she said, it's an Irish strength to celebrate the people in our past, not for power or victory or glory, but for the profound human dignity of survival. And if nothing else, the Irish have always been great survivors. In the 19th century, people like Raftery, the poet, would travel the roads of Connacht during the summer, and he'd come to a house, as he did on one occasion, where a poor couple who were getting married, they had a couple of herrings and a loaf of bread and nothing more, but after he had stayed with them, played for them, spoke to them, told them stories, and left, it was as if they had a feast fit for a prince. The Irish have always had the ability to allow the riches of the imagination to overcome the material poverty. And that, up until recently, remained the case. Martin mentioned the great things that, and they certainly are great things, that Enterprise Ireland and the IDA and so on have done to bring jobs into Ireland and Ireland's role in the new economy and so on. Why then are so many people dissatisfied, if that is the case, if there is an optimistic story coming from Ireland? I would suggest that people have lost the skill of storytelling. They've lost the old traditions to a great extent. As soon as the Celtic Tiger made its appearance, we saw people building motorways through Tara. We saw a change to the Constitution where Daniel O'Connell's great principle that if you are born in Ireland, you are Irish, a geographical definition of Irishness, which was written away in the Irish Constitution by a referendum a couple of years back. We've had the Brown Envelope Society, the Golden Circles of the Galway Tent of capitalists and builders and developers and bankers who are corrupt. And that has taken away. Recently, last week, reading the Irish Times, Brother Kevin, a Franciscan in Dublin, noted that 3 men had died on the street of Dublin last week, homeless men. There was a conference at Trinity College about young people harming themselves. 12,000 young people, mostly girls, have been treated for self-harming in Ireland. And those at the conference reckoned that the total number is around 60,000. So what has happened? Why are these things happening in Ireland? And I would say that what happened was the Celtic Tiger came along and people threw out the old ways. You cannot do that. The traditions that bind people together, the sense of community. And it's continuing as we speak. I was talking to Father Leonard there earlier, and there was a conference at Trinity yesterday, and a professor said that the figures for immigration are exaggerated, that roughly 50,000 a year. Half of those, he said, were immigrants going home or going to work in London on the building sites for the Olympic Village. But if you talk, as Father Leonard mentioned, to the parishes and the GAA clubs, they'll tell you that they are collapsing. GAA clubs from Clare up to Donegal don't have enough members to put a team on the field. So the question then is, what is the future? Do we have a future? Well, we have to have a future that is, I'm not an economist, but we have to have a future that is not based on the economy. Ireland's self-respect deserves more than being a cog or a hub, an innovative hub, as Brian, the Pastiche called it, an innovative hub in the chain of world capitalism. That's just not good enough. We have to get back to the values, the traditions of the past. I don't care how far back we want to go, but we can certainly talk about that. Despite, the situation is that despite decades of educational expansion, we have actually become a dependent people again. Unable to provide for the coming generation or to legislate in according with our wishes. This is the fact of where we are today. If we continue to externalize the source of vitality in our society, leaving adaptation to international economic circumstances as the primary rationale for politics, which is what it has become. We will end without a state of our own and without a decent society to live in. And again, not to finish on too much of a pessimistic note, the first Irish government in 1922, Kevin O'Higgins, described them as 80 young men in City Hall who, standing in the rubble of a failed regime, without yet having the foundation for a new one, and wild men screeching in through the keyhole. Well, we have a new government in Ireland today, and they're standing in the rubble of the past. I don't know if they have a foundation or not, but it's not the wild men who are screaming in the door, but it's the International Bank, the IFM, and the European banks. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, John, for those remarks. So the here is that I'm going to try to press the panelists on a few issues over the next 25 minutes or so, and then we're going to throw it open to the floor for questions and answers, and we have about 45 minutes for that. So we'll come into you all fairly soon. But I wanted to go back to this idea that Peter brought up, that the number one issue in the Irish economy and in Ireland's future is really this debt, the banking debt that was incurred on September 29, 2008. Because it seems to me that the Irish government, this new Irish government, has said that they want to restructure the debt. They've been very clear about that. They went, Kenny went to meet Merkel last week at a party leaders meeting in Europe, and she was very clear to him that there will be no restructuring of the debt as far as Germany was concerned. And Enda Kenny then said that in light of that he would be looking for concessions on the interest rates. And many of you may have read the press today that Sarkozy and Kenny were in a fight at 1 in the morning in Brussels, where Sarkozy said, you must, bring up your corporation tax, and Kenny, said later it was a Gallic spat between the two, but there was no way that he would agree to that, and the government, as Martin, I think, indicated in his remarks, is very clear that there will be no change. So the question really is, how do you restructure this debt when, Europe is saying that it cannot be restructured, because they have two particular points of leverage. The first, which is often overlooked, is that they provide at 1% interest rates emergency liquidity to the Irish banks in the tens of billions. And if that was pulled, the banks would probably collapse. And the second is that the ECB provides the bulk of the IMF ECB deal for the continuing financing of the government. So Peter, I'd like you to sort of elaborate on what you mean by default in practical terms, and how would you get others to agree? And if you couldn't, would it be unilateral, and what would that unilateral, would that look like Kazakhstan? Would it be like, what would the model be for how that would work?
Well, if you default, what happens is the creditors get property. Right now, what stood behind those loans was some type of property development, whether it's finished or partially done. And so the creditors would end up with the property, which they could sell on the market for whatever they could get for it. But there would certainly be real losses to the creditors. But it's better than distributing those losses to Irish people who are not even part of these transactions. Why should they have to bear the losses? And even if the Irish are able to get the Europeans to reduce the interest, the principle is still there. I mean, the problem is the principle is too big, and the tax increases that are going to have to be exacted on the Irish economy to pay off that principle or the interest are going to undermine the economy, and so it's going to create more discontent among the public. It doesn't seem to me that Europe has all the leverage that they think they have. Yes, if you want more European aid, but what if why make a deal with the devil? Just say, look, we don't want the aid. I mean, Europe's not going to kick Ireland out of the Eurozone. And I think it helps the Euro to allow an Irish default to end the culture of bailouts, because otherwise the Euro is going to collapse. eventually, if they don't solve this problem of moral hazard, then the debts are going to just keep increasing, because every member nation has an incentive to go deeper into debt, because otherwise it's simply going to be there to bail out the other countries. So you have no fiscal responsibility. I mean, initially when they conceived of the euro, they had a fiscal responsibility pact. You couldn't have any debts that was greater than 3% of GDP. What happened to that? So something has to happen. And, I think the one thing that's going to benefit the euro in the short run is the demise of the dollar. And so that might temporarily create some demand for euros. But I think if the Irish stand firm, I think they have the cards, because they have to agree to pay the loans back. And if they don't want to do it, the government's like, I'm not guaranteeing these debts. So they're still able to go into court and try to get whatever they can from the original obligor on the debt instruments. And of course, some of the banks would fail. There's no question that some banks would fail. So let them fail. I mean, it's better than the whole country failing.
But one of the problems is that,
Oh,
Yeah, you do.
sorry. A couple of points. Number one, I think it's too late to pretend that there's an easy way out of this, or that there's a cost-free way out of this. It's a choice at this point of bad options and less bad options. Personally, I don't think the Irish government is going to unilaterally default, and I don't think they should unilaterally default. I do think they're going to move inevitably to a negotiated restructuring of the debt, because it is, as presently structured, simply too onerous, and it would be like a millstone around the economy's neck indefinitely. But the difference between a unilateral default, where the debtor, in this case Ireland, simply says, I'm not going to pay, and a negotiated restructuring where Ireland would sit down with its European partners in Frankfurt and Brussels and say, look guys, this ain't working, let's, among ourselves, work out a deal to extend the maturity, cut the interest rate, make something practical. The difference between those two is the difference between jumping into a swimming pool, which would be fun, and jumping off a 10-story building, which is not fun. Jumping off a 10-story building is a unilateral default. Jumping into the swimming pool would be the negotiated restructuring, because the consequences of a unilateral default are immediate and long-lasting. Argentina, which defaulted 10 years ago, their corporations are paying today an extra 5 percentage points on a loan. So instead of borrowing at 4 or 5%, they're borrowing at 9 or 10%. So the consequences linger, not to mention the reputational damage for a small, open economy like Ireland, which is absolutely dependent upon foreign investment and being perceived as an attractive, stable, dependable place to do business. To unilaterally default in the face of objections from its EU partners would be suicidal.
Question, how does whether the Irish government defaults or not affect the credit rating of a private sector borrower in Ireland?
At this point, it's all lumped together.
But it's not. I mean, a creditor, if there's an Irish business that wants a loan, and they have collateral and they have an income, and you can evaluate it, it's going to be judged on its own merit. Remember, the loan is euro denominated, so it doesn't matter about the credit. What the credit rating only matters to the Irish government. It doesn't matter to.
It's mattering today to Argentina.
Well, if there's a higher yield on that corporate rate, it's because of the currency risk. It's not going to be. Lenders are going to evaluate the credit quality, and as long as the one thing that they might worry about would be, well, the court system is, are my property rights going to be respected?
Peter, you're talking about unilateral default as if it's a cost-free exercise.
No, it's not. But I think
it's
default.
Not,
Default.
The Irish government at the moment is dependent upon the goodwill of its European partners, not just to cover its banking needs, but to fund the deficit. Let me finish. To fund the deficit in its ongoing operations. If the EU pulls that financing, then the Irish taxpayer has to close that deficit tomorrow with reduced services or higher taxes.
This is debt that the Irish government never really undertook. They didn't have to bail out these banks. They could have let them fail.
Right. You're not talking about the
talking about the debt that they guaranteed, private sector debt that they came up and guaranteed. Those creditors would have lost that money anyway. And now the government came in and said, oh, don't worry, the Irish public will bail you out. They shouldn't have done that. And they can acknowledge that that was a mistake and not continue it. And so you go back and you negotiate, this is a private sector debt. I'm not talking about Ireland saying the money that the Irish government borrowed, where they actually sold Irish government bonds and said, we're going to pay you back. I'm not talking about that debt. I'm talking about where somebody loaned money to a bank and now they've got government debt because the politicians didn't have the guts to let these banks fail, and they put the taxpayers on the hook. They shouldn't have done that, and they can't keep
I mean, I think there's huge support in Ireland for what you're saying in terms of separating out the banking debt that was given in September 08 versus the Irish sovereign debt. The problem that people who advocate that, and many of them were at that economics festival that you were at, and I think Dave McWilliams, who organized it, was one of the leading advocates. The problem is that it's not just a matter of getting off the sort of funding from Europe. There's a 19 billion euro hole right in the Irish exchequer. That money is coming from the ECB and IMF. And so while you could wean yourself off that over a 4 or 5 year period, which they're trying to do, if they did that tomorrow, they would have a 30% gap between, they basically wouldn't be able to pay for nurses and
Well, I'm not against the restructure that you're speaking of, but
There's a big difference between unilateral and negotiating.
but I think default is better than paying in full. Paying in full is I think is.
But that's why I said, I think inevitably it's moving to negotiating.
Right,
structure,
but the fact that Greece has the option of default is what brings them to the negotiating table. If you take off, if I'm never going to default, then why restructure?
Let's bring in Martin here. Martin, I'd like you to try to address this. I think everyone agrees that some sort of restructuring will be ideal. The government has said that, but how does this work when the key partners have been very clear that they do not want to participate in that process? What is this multilateral sort of structured, default or renegotiation? What does that look like when the French and the German governments have said no?
Okay, but I'll come to that, but can I just get in on the conversation that was going to my right here just for a little while? I think there's a whole question about default, whether it should happen, how it should happen, and what degrees it should happen. There's also a parallel debate that is involved in all of this, and that is whether or not the Irish government should have guaranteed the bank debts. And I think the greatest thing in the world is 2020 hindsight vision. Unfortunately, none of us have that, and indeed the governments, whether dealing with imminent crisis, don't have that. They deal with the issues that they have at the time. They deal with the issues and the information they have at the time. And at the time of the government decision, and indeed there are many parties, many individuals that will speak very strongly and oppose the decision of the government at the time to cover that debt. We were looking at a very significant, probable, not potential, probable rupture of the banking system of the country that would have overnight brought the entire structure and the operation of the state to a screeching halt. We're not talking about a situation where you're talking about one bank in a very large continent or subcontinent in trouble. We're talking about a banking situation that had an immediate impact right across the economy. And decisions were made in the light of the pressure at the time and with the information available at the time. As it turned out, that information was incomplete, and as time wore on, the debt that the government guaranteed became greater and greater, to the point where at this stage there is little difference between the sovereign debt and commercial debts. And it is that point where we're talking about, well, can we default now? Or what are we talking about default? Like, we've already given guarantees, and we've made certain commitments, international commitments, certain structure of our economy and how we're going to carry forward our debt into the future, and indeed how we're going to deal with our economy in our efforts to deal with that debt. And if I might just refer to that part of it before I go on, I think it's important to realise that severe and all as the debt to GDP ratio is at the moment, we have been in worse situations. The debt to GDP ratio that we had in the 80s was significantly worse than what we have at the moment. Now, I grant you that once the issues of the 80s were beginning to be addressed, you had a global economy that was picking up. There was a certain number of confluence of economic issues within Europe and Ireland and the world that actually contributed to the maximum of less is more, because the government actually reduced taxes, but paradoxically, by reducing the taxes, they managed to increase the revenue. But that was a particular set of national and international economics at the time. And what I'm trying to say is that, you know, it's not exactly the same now, but we're not exactly as bad as we were then. There are different strengths and safety nets that are within the European and global market that are going to come into play. Now, I don't think that you could look to any positive outcome for a small country like Ireland, so open in its economy, so dependent on international relations, to actually default in its sovereign debt. Just is inconceivable. And that, whatever economists may view that in terms of abstract economic theories, for the larger global economy, in terms of the small Irish open economy, this is just a good start. It just will not happen. Now, you've asked me, where do we go from here? And in recognizing the difficulty and the deep hole that the Irish people are in, there are a number of different levels at which this issue is going to have to be treated. And indeed, you know, there's progress already at one level, and there's indications of possible avenues to follow in another. The one where we have indications of progress is the question of the interest rate. One of the major issues in the general election campaign in Ireland were difficulties due to the interest rate. Paradoxically, there wasn't as much coverage on the size of the debt. And if you're seriously worried as a nation about the interest rate to cover, and we're not looking at the size of the debt that it relates to, there's something missing in the debate. But to deal with the question of the interest rate, there is discussions going on within Europe at the moment. The European Commission has already come out and spoken in favour of the reduction of the interest rates. And I think it is reasonable to expect that ongoing negotiations will result in easing of that area. The question of the size of the debt.
Hang on a second. On Friday night, Greece got a reduction at 1 basis point, 1 percentage point in their interest rate, because they agreed to sell off certain public assets that they didn't want to do, but they did it to get that reduction. And that reduction was not accepted by Enda Kenny because he would not accept the Merkel-Sarkozy demand on the corporation tax. So why do you think, when you say negotiations are ongoing, I mean they are, but there was a very clear sort of negative answer. So what is the strategy or of the government, or what leverage does the Irish government have to persuade Mr. Sarkozy that they should get that cut as well without any increase in the corporate tax rate?
I would have to say, to start off in answering that question, I'm not involved in the direct day-to-day negotiations that are going on there, but I have been involved in the business of Europe for a period of about 6 years as a member of Irish delegation to the EU. So I have a sense of the pace at which decisions are made. I've also sense of the relationship, or indeed sometimes the non-relationship between public pronouncements and what is actually going ahead in terms of substantive negotiations. The decision process on the question of the interest rate is going to take time. It's not going to be something that will be agreed in coming weeks or months. This is going to take time. And if you look at, you know, the pound of flesh that various politicians are looking for, I don't want to be too dismissive of the various positions taken public, but nonetheless, politicians speak to a number of different audiences simultaneously. We've had an experience of that within Ireland during the period leading up to the involvement of the EU and IMF. The government was saying, no, there is no arrangement, there is no negotiations. They were factually correct. There were no basic negotiations underway because formal negotiations hadn't been initiated. But that is not to say that discussions were taking place behind closed doors. And I think the same probably applies within the broader European picture. There are certain political realities on the ground in both Germany and pressure being placed on that 12.5%, and we have repeatedly insisted that that is not going to change. It cannot happen without Irish acceptance of the change. It is not something that is majority decision within Europe. It has to be by consensus. Ireland has to agree to it, and Ireland will not agree to it. I think it is important in this context that we talk about the issue that we're facing. It is not simply an Irish problem. This is a Euro problem. This is a problem for the EU. This is something that will be sorted out and discussed over a period of time, hopefully as short as possible. But ways will be found. There is already discussion underway in terms of burden sharing. Timing of that, when is that going to happen? Under what terms will it happen? What circumstances can we permit the concept of burden sharing to be developed and evolved and agreed as part of EU policy? And that is where the distinction has to rest from Ireland's point of view. Ireland would not see it conceivable that we can talk about unilateral default of sovereign debt. And that's...
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to bring John in for your perspective on this. Is largely about those economic concept, but a broader sort of broader.
Well, one of the problems for Ireland is that Europe, the EU, is using Ireland as an example to Spain and Italy to get their houses in order, and so they cannot be easy on Ireland and then expect to be hard on Spain and Italy when and if they default. As far as the German economists are concerned, they are sympathetic to our situation. They look on Greece as a country that committed a crime against the EU. They look on the Irish as a people who suffered a tragedy, even though the ordinary German believes that Ireland got a donation and not a loan from the EU. So I think there's need for clearing up certainly a lot of issues for good PR within Europe on behalf of Ireland's situation. But I do agree with Martin that I don't think Ireland can renege and survive with any dignity or respect or any future.
Thank you. Peter, how important is this corporation, tax issue? We hear all the time that this is a core issue for American investors in Ireland, that if there's any move on the corporation tax in an upward direction, that the effect will be catastrophic. What's your analysis of it?
Well, certainly, the best corporate tax would be zero. I don't know why Ireland doesn't abolish it completely. Why you have a 12.5% But yeah, I mean, look, Europe, certainly Europe wants to pressure Ireland to raise taxes. All politicians want everybody else's taxes higher, because obviously there's going to be businesses that are going to move from higher tax jurisdictions within Europe that would move to Ireland. You know, we're seeing that right now with states in the United States. We're here, you know, they're raising taxes in Illinois, and you know, other states like Wisconsin are advertising, move here, businesses move here, where you've got a lower tax rate. So, you know, when one entity has a high tax, they want to make sure their neighbors have a high tax too, so that the taxpayers have no escape. So yeah, to the extent that Ireland complies and raises taxes, then they're going to have fewer businesses that are going to want to move to Ireland. I mean, the best way for Ireland to get out of this ditch is to have as much investment and production and capital investment and real job creation as possible. And that means a small government. That means minimal taxes. That means minimal regulation. But my fear is that in order to pay back this debt, they're going to do the wrong thing. It's going to be higher taxes. And ultimately what that, you know, that might benefit some of the other European nations, because now, you know, companies that might have otherwise been able to move to Ireland, well, now they're not going to do it because they're not going to get that tax advantage. So as I said, I'd rather see Ireland, you know, whether it's default or restructuring, and you know, one of the weapons that it has, you know, is look, we'll just abolish our tax and make it a complete tax haven in Europe, and you know, we'll see how many companies, you know, don't want to come here. Make it like the Hong Kong of Europe. It was on the way of going in that direction before it got sidetracked with the housing bubble.
Mr. Sarkozy would love that. Can we just hold that thought for a few minutes, and I'm sure we'll come back up in the Q&A. But before we go to the audience, because I do want to go to everyone in a minute, I want to ask David a question, just in the context of the Taoiseach Enda Kenny's visit to the United States next week, or this week, I guess. He's in Washington on Thursday. And in May of 2009, President Obama was burning up the phones to Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy on the eve of the Greek bailout, encouraging them to be more forward-leaning and more enlightened in terms of getting Greece a deal and getting them a package, because there was recognition, albeit late recognition, in Washington and in the Treasury Department that the euro crisis could affect the American and the global economy. It wasn't just a European, you know, issue. And with the connectedness of the debt that sort of came up here earlier, it's pretty clear that it's also sort of systemic. And so, do you think that Enda Kenny should press President Obama to get in the game a bit at the end of March with the EU summit to encourage Germany and France to take a holistic approach to the crisis, and to have some sort of renegotiation and restructuring, as the IMF had suggested in the initial negotiations with Ireland?
I think the reality is the president has one or two other things on his plate. The administration in 2010, I think, did see the European crisis in its early stages as something that not only threatened to derail the nascent recovery, but that ultimately did cost the U.S. some growth in the first quarter in particular. I think the sense now is that despite the sort of slow walking that European leaders have done over the course of the last year and a half, really just enough at several key junctures to ward off disaster, but never really enough to fully resolve the problem. Although that, given what happened last night, that may be starting to change. I do think the perception now in Washington is that among the threats to the U.S. and global recovery, the European crisis is still out there, but it's not sort of the most pressing issue. So
would that change if Spain came under pressure? I mean,
yeah, Spain is the one that everybody has pointed to, and what's been difficult in terms of watching this crisis is, you know, if you look at some of the key market metrics over the course of time, whether it's the 10-year bond or the price for credit insurance on the sovereign debt of the various countries, there have been, you know, several false dawns where it was possible to say, gee, look at the markets, things are calming down, I guess the EU has finally gotten ahead of the problem, and no sooner than the words come out of your mouth, shock somewhere. Portugal has looked as if it was about to tumble into the bailout abyss. Its rates of the 10-year bond have been well north of 7% for roughly a month now, which is longer than either Ireland or Greece was in that same category before succumbing. So the expectation is that one of these days Portugal will go, and the key test really is whether the EU has drawn a firewall around Spain, because that as an economy is, from memory, roughly 10 times the size of the Irish economy. Spain is a big world economy, and if that were to go, there'd be serious questions about the ability of the EU to bail them out.
Okay, great. I think we'll go to the audience and then we'll come back to all of the panelists as well at the end, but obviously we'll answer questions as we go. And I think what we'll do is we'll start off by taking 2 questions at a time. And we may end up going, depending on the demand, either going down to 1 or up to 3, and we'll come back to the panelists and ask them. So we, gentlemen in the front row here.
Hold on 1 second, sorry. I'll just ask that you keep questions to questions and not opinions, but also be brief. Thank you.
I've actually got a comment for David, Martin, and John that it all ties together. David, you mentioned that the price for a default would be, the example you used was when Argentina defaulted, that the corporate tax, the interest that was paid on corporate loans was 5%. Well, with all due respect, I mean, I can get 5% of my money on accident.
No, it's 5% higher. In other words, if you were in a Chilean company or a Brazilian company and you were paying X, in Argentina you're paying an X plus 5%. So
Give me a real world number example.
I'm making up the real world number, but if it was 4% in Chile, it'd be 9% in Argentina.
Talk about in the same currency or different currencies?
Well, why did you just
Well,
continue
even
with
at 9%, I mean, I can make 9% of my money on accident. If these are supposed to be brilliant minds running a corporation, they shouldn't balk at 9%. That's not a price. I mean, that's not a real world price. I mean, that's the price. They get a letter of default, and the price is they pay 9% on their loan. That'd be like if you killed somebody and somebody said, go in the corner for timeout. And Martin, the prices you mentioned on the EU will turn its back on Ireland, or other countries won't want to do business with Ireland. They want to move their businesses there. Whether we like it or not, whether it's right or wrong, the reality is people are in business to make money. And if you present an opportunity for a country, a company in your country to make money, no matter how bad Ireland wronged some other creditors in the past, you show them an opportunity to make money, they will go there.
Let's take a second.
Right,
And John,
We're going to take 2 questions,
and
and then we'll come back
for
to
you mentioned in your commentary that Ireland, people from Ireland are survivors. That through all the hardship that they've suffered over the years, they survived. Well, if some of you believe that if there's a universal default and the EU will shut them down and they will be basically isolated from the rest of the world, well, here's a chance to prove it. If people from Ireland are survivors, here's a chance to prove it.
Okay, we
My
got
point was that
we're going to go to a second question, then we'll come back to the panel. So, gentlemen here in the second row.
Can I just jump in really quickly, sorry, sir, and just reiterate that you should keep questions to questions?
Come back to
I walked in a couple of minutes late. If you cover this, I apologize. Prior to this situation, what were the rules analogous to the FDIC in America for protection of individual Irish depositors at these relevant banks? And secondly, other than the loss of stock, obvious loss of stockholders, et cetera, who or what was at risk with the deposits that afforded this debacle to happen?
Okay, we're going to take those, we're going to go, and you cannot, if you don't want to answer, that's fine, but we'll go Peter, Martin, David, and then John.
And most of the risk was the creditors that had loaned the money. It wasn't, the deposits, I think, were a smaller part of the problem. The larger problem were the individual loans that were made, and the bank itself. The banks would have failed it. But banks fail. I mean, they would have restructured. I mean, you mentioned at the time, I forget what you said, that yes, there would have been a very sharp economic crisis had the government not bailed out all these financial institutions. Yes, but it would be over, and Ireland would not be in the trouble that it's in today. The problem is politicians always do what's politically expedient. There were plenty of people who would have objected to those bailouts at the time. Just like there were people in the United States objecting to the TARP and the things that we did. And believe me, the things that we did, the economic crisis that America is about to go through in the next year or two, maybe 3, but it's going to be horrific. It's going to be much worse than what we would have went through had we not bailed out those banks. But the politicians, they don't see beyond the next election. They just see, what can we do right now to put a Band-Aid on this situation? And that's what they did. And now, they put a Band-Aid on it, and now it's not a cut anymore, it's a cancer.
And briefly on, I know you want to get back on the tax haven thing, but briefly.
All right, I'll be as brief as I can. A couple of things. The cost of default. I'm not quite sure that I would measure it, whether it's X or Y extra interest points on the cost we would have for the loan. I think the concern in Ireland was at the time that it would be whether we would get any money at all. If the whole conduit of money that is available through national borrowing, if that is to dry up, you're talking about the entire country coming to a grinding halt. We're talking about not being able to pay our nurses, our police, our defence forces. That is the catastrophic scenario that the government at the time was looking at. And I think if you roll that forward, and let's say we default at this stage, you're talking about very serious contagion in terms of whether or not we can realistically borrow going into the future. It's a question of whether it's available or not. And I've heard comments relate that, okay, burn the bond holders, but we won't do business with you again. And that was the cost. Question of the cost to depositors and what was guaranteed and so forth. I think what we're talking about here is another aspect of how banks do business. If they don't have depositors, they can't give loans. And there is an ongoing serious concerns about the flight of capital. There are current difficulties in businesses obtaining credit. These are issues that we are trying to deal with. What we are trying to have is an orderly way of dealing with the issue rather than relying on kind of knee-jerk reactions. And I do have to come back to the question about the tax haven. Ireland has developed a reputation, and I know you say that if we can give you a deal, you do business, but Ireland has developed a reputation of doing solid business, working very sensibly within the international structure. We are strong believers in international regulation and multilateral regulation because we're a tiny country, 4 million people, we're a cork bobbing around in the ocean. We have to be, and this is a very strong economic view of ours. And the idea of being associated with any tax haven is completely anathema to the policy of successive governments in Ireland. And it's just not somewhere we would go.
Did you a very brief?
Yeah, just a very brief point on this. I think the fact that there are a few tax havens out there, it's a good thing. The tax havens do us all a favor because they keep the politicians, it puts some limit to how high they can raise your taxes. The ability to snuff out the tax havens means that the other countries can raise their taxes that much more. Everybody tries to say, oh, blame the tax haven nations for siphoning off some of these businesses, but if you get rid of all the tax havens, everybody is going to pay more taxes.
I'm sorry, Ireland was, no, I have to deal with that.
Don't say it's a bad thing to run tax haven. We need tax haven.
Continue this afterwards, so we're going to
I think this is enormously important.
Yeah, no,
From my point of view,
I'm sure
I'm representing a government Ireland is a member of the EU. We are solid supporters of the international regime. We are not going into the business of tax haven, whatever.
I think that's clear.
All I'm saying is that's not necessarily a good thing. There's nothing wrong with being a tax haven.
For Ireland and Germany there is.
I think the thing I find about tax havens is they all seem to have sunnier weather than Ireland. So we'll go to David.
Far be it for me to stick up for politicians, but I do want to make a sort of mild historical clarification. I don't think the failure of the Irish government in September 2008, when under enormous pressure they issued this extraordinary blanket guarantee of the entire banking system, was because they accurately diagnosed the problem and made a conscious decision to kick the problem down the road and try to hide it. I think the reason they did that was because, again, put yourself back in September 2008. This is 2 weeks after Lehman Brothers has gone bankrupt, and the entire global credit system has frozen up. Nobody trusts anybody else. Banks don't trust other banks. Nobody knows what the bottom is going to be. And it was a time of fear, not just in the private economy, but in government circles. And I think that explains the mistaken decision, that working in the middle of the night, these guys, running a small country and frankly maybe a little out of their depth, trying to play in global finance. And they made the wrong move. They probably should have let Anglo-Irish go under because that wasn't systemically important. And they extended the guarantee too far, but I think they did it because what they thought they were seeing was a liquidity problem. In other words, a temporary problem of cash, not a solvency problem where the banks were bust. Their assets were garbage and they weren't worth anything. And so they thought, the government officials thought, if we can use the power of the sovereign to just ride out this temporary panic in the market. And there's a whole history of panics that go back in markets for hundreds of years. And they wrongly thought that we'll use the sovereign power to bridge this crisis, and then we'll come out at the other end. And they were wrong. But it's not, I don't think, because they consciously made a correct diagnosis and tried to pull one over.
You know what they say about the road to hell? And politicians have repeated these mistakes over and over again, and they just keep
so
out.
many people in the private markets. I mean, the banks are responsible for much of this problem.
The
And the banks did it on their own hook because
No.
they saw a chance to make money.
No,
and that doesn't make them
the government,
but they were
no,
wrong
but
also.
the government gave them that chance by keeping interest rates too low and guaranteeing their debts. These are not private sector mistakes, they're government mistakes. And the governments are compounding mistakes. And 2 wrongs or a dozen wrongs don't make a right. We have to acknowledge what we've done wrong and stop doing it.
We're going to go to John, and then we're going to go back to the audience, and what we're going to try to do is to take a mix of questions in the back and the front. So I see a few people in the front. We'll come back to you, but we're going to go to the back next round. So John.
Just in response to the gentleman's question about the role of the banks, one issue we haven't talked about is the mortgages that the banks were giving out, 100% and over 100% mortgages in many cases, which means that there are about at least 300,000 people in negative equity who are trying to pay off. And as Morgan Kelly, the economist at UCD, has pointed out, we're looking down the road to the equivalent of the land war of the late 19th century, because we have these people who are impoverished. But for the Irish, it's a great shame to lose your house or to be in debt. And so people will do anything at the moment to avoid it, but that's cracking. I was talking to a gentleman from the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Cork, and he mentioned that people who last year or year before that were a couple were earning €80,000 a year, they're now coming to the St. Vincent de Paul. But they want to hold on to their house. They sacrifice food, they sacrifice clothing, entertainment, and so on. And as he pointed out, even to the extent of using newspaper for bathroom tissue, which he hadn't seen since the 1950s in Ireland. So that is something that's coming along the road. And what's going to happen is, we already have the division between the public sector and the private sector, that people who have defaulted and will default, as it's bound to happen, is people will go for food and give up the house or whatever, and will have to be bailed out in some way and receive some kind of help. And the people who have bought their houses long ago are going to say, why should we as taxpayers pay for the people who bought their house during the great Celtic Tiger boom? And that division will be very unsettling for Irish society.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go back to the audience. I see we have some hands up back there. We're going to take 3 questions, and if I could ask the panelists to hold their fire until the end of the 3rd question, and then we'll come back. So,
Mr. Lynch, could you explain why Iceland shouldn't be the, I'm thinking that Iceland should be the example for Ireland as opposed to Argentina. Could you give us your thoughts on that?
okay. We have, if you take that person there, and then is there a second microphone? If we could go over there for the 3rd question. So, yeah.
This is for Martin. You mentioned earlier there's no difference between corporate and sovereign debt. Can you please explain that to me in Irish terms? It's very different there. And the cost of borrowing is always different. And the rewards are different as well.
Okay, and then this gentleman.
Could each of the panelists give one specific suggestion as to what the new government should do? And for Peter, you got to assume that they're not going to default on their sovereign debt. But one specific example as to what should be done for each of you, please.
Okay, we're going to go in reverse order. So, John, if we start with you this time.
Well, one of the things the government should do is to make bankruptcy much easier for ordinary people, as it is here in the United States.
Okay, great. Martin?
Okay, do I talk about the sovereign debt?
Yeah, all of the questions.
I think what we've had a situation where the government has in fact bought banks. Anglo-Irish, the entire debt, such as it is, has been absorbed into the government. So it has moved from being commercial debt into sovereign debt. In other words, the government owns that debt. Similarly with Anglo-Irish and Nationwide, their debts have been basically covered by the sovereign, by the Irish national, every one of our taxpayers. So it is that debt is now added to the debt that we have borrowed over the years to run the country, to invest in our road networks, to invest in our communications, to pay our nurses and doctors, and you name it. So all of this, the sovereign and the commercial debt are almost totally intertwined at this point. So if the Irish government goes out looking for money, the bondholders are looking at the total picture of the debt that the state of Ireland is dealing with. And the question is, as has been addressed earlier on here, is can Ireland cover it? And that's the major issue that we're facing at the moment. I hope that answers that particular question. In relation to what should the government do, I can give you a whole list of them.
Just one. Your favorite.
Well, I think the Irish people have voted very significantly for the change of government. But there are echoes of we want change, and I don't think the people of Ireland know exactly what the change is going to be. The change is going to be very painful. There are going to be extra taxes. There are going to be reductions in services. There would be efforts to close the gap between expenditure and revenue. They're going to have to work on it.
The difficulty with the Iceland case as a potential model for Ireland is that Iceland has its own currency, and so has been able to follow the traditional path that countries from the Asian financial crisis, Russia and elsewhere, have used to come back from disasters like this, which is you cheapen the currency, use that to promote exports and climb out of the hole that way. Ireland, by virtue of being in the Eurozone, doesn't have that ability, and thus has to suffer through what's called an internal devaluation. To answer the question about what one specific thing should Ireland do, I would argue that it should protect education at all costs as it goes through the process of closing the deficit. Craig Barrett from Intel, who was the head of the company when Intel made the decision to go into leak slip back in the late 1980s, was at the Farmley Conference, 2009, I believe, and said that there were 14 factors that Intel had looked at that ultimately led it to choose Ireland over Scotland or other places. And of those 14 factors, he said only one still obtained, and that was the low corporate tax rate. So protecting education and the skills of the workforce is critical.
I'll just have one comment on what you said about inflation. Printing money is not a panacea, it's not a way out. If you're against default, printing money is the same thing as default. You pay back your creditors with the value of money. Well, you said that Iceland, they don't have to suffer as much as they can print money. They have a solution. But you said because you can devalue the currency, so they don't have to suffer the internal devaluation. But printing a lot of money is not. Don't act like, okay, well, Ireland wouldn't have problems if they could just print points, because you have, of course, probably the gentleman at the end talked about the people in Ireland using newspaper as toilet paper. Well, the Americans are going to be using dollars as toilet paper. We're going to try to solve our problem that way. I think a good example about
You've been saying that
Iceland.
for 5 years, and maybe if you wait long enough, it'll happen, but you haven't been right.
Wait a minute, I haven't been right? I haven't been right for the past 5 years? Since I started telling people to sell the dollar's at a record low against the Swiss franc, it's at a record low against the Australian dollar. When I started shorting the dollar and telling my clients to get out of the dollar index was over 100. Right now it's barely 75 because it's being supported. But I've been wrong. I started buying gold at $250 an ounce. I started buying silver. How much gold and silver do you own?
You've been talking about hyperinflation for years.
Did you short?
The inflation rate is a historic low.
No, that's because you don't understand what inflation is. It's not a historic low at all. If it was an historic low, commodity prices wouldn't be at record highs. Metal prices wouldn't be at record highs. And you talked about the people didn't know in advance. Were you shorting the subprime mortgages? Did you see this crisis coming? Did you know Freddie and Fannie were going to go bankrupt? How did I know all that stuff? Did I just guess?
Back to the audience, we have a few questions down the front. So if we just take these to this gentleman in the front row and the second, and then we'll go up to, I think, you in the back as well.
You talked about that if Ireland defaults, they can borrow, but wasn't borrowing the problem? They borrowed too much money, and that's only going to make things worse if they continue to borrow and continue to increase the debt. So wouldn't default, as Mr. Schiff has been saying, be the right thing, and then they can start saving and reducing things?
Okay, and then the gentleman in the second row.
The new government, they have the horses to make changes that they were talking about.
Do they have the
Votes and that.
and at the back? Yeah.
Pete, you were just talking about the U.S. dollar, and I was wondering, given the current circumstances, things like the Tea Party coming, Ron Paul going to be head of the Monetary Policy Committee, or the congressional part that talks to the Monetary Policy Committee. I wanted your opinion on if you do think continued quantitative easing can continue, and if it can't, how this inflationary scenario can still continue to play out with all the massive, I think there's like $65 trillion of debt outstanding, and we currently only monetize about 2 to 2.1 trillion of it. Can the Fed even do it? Is it politically feasible? Is it possible?
Okay, most of these questions are to Peter, so I think what we'll do is we'll take you, and then if someone wants to give one of the rest of the panel, trying to get the continuity report, then we'll back to the
Quantitative easing or money printing, debt monetization will continue. The Fed is just bluffing that quantitative easing is going to end. The Federal Reserve right now is buying 70% of all the net new issues of U.S. Treasuries. The other 30% is being bought by foreign central banks. Now, whether the Japanese central bank is going to keep buying now that it's got the earthquake to deal with, maybe we've lost another one of our major creditors. But if the Fed were to back away from these treasury bond auctions, and they're now massive, I mean, in the month of February alone, the federal government had to borrow $225 billion, I think was the February deficit, and you have all this short-term debt, that is rolling over. The government has a very short maturity on the national debt, so every month, I think last month, I think we had half a billion in treasuries matured. So the government had to go out there and find new lenders. And the Federal Reserve is the main lender. So if the Fed were to back away from the treasury bond market, and in fact, if they became sellers, which they would have to do if they stopped QE2, because their balance sheet notes would be maturing, interest rates would skyrocket. I mean, short-term rates would go up, long-term rates would go up, and then every bank that was bailed out would fail again. In order to keep this phony economy going, the only way to do it is for the Fed to be in there. And so they're not going away. They're just going to keep printing money and buying bonds. And as more and more people around the world figure this out, they're not going to want those bonds. They're going to sell their bonds, just like Bill Brooks. I mean, Bill Brooks is the owner of the largest bond fund in the world, and he has sold every single treasury that he owns. He's liquidated about 150 billion worth of treasuries, and obviously he sold them to the Federal Reserve because the Federal Reserve is the only main buyer other than foreign central banks. So if you can't get the owner, the manager of the world's biggest bond fund to buy your bonds, who is going to buy them? I mean, there are no buyers out there for treasuries. I said this initially when they announced in QE2, that the real reason they were doing it was because there were no buyers. The Fed was trying to come in and buy treasuries because they knew that private demand for our debt was going away, because creditors know that we will default, and we won't default the way a country like Ireland might default. We'll default the way Argentina did. We can print dollars. We can put as many zeros as we want on a dollar bill, and unfortunately that's what's going to happen. And if you measure the CPI the way we used to measure it before they screwed it up in the 1990s, CPI inflation is still running about 8, 9, 10% right now. And imagine how high it's going to be in the next few years.
Okay, does anyone else want to
What was the question?
Are they going to stop the QE?
Well, the question was on quantitative easing, and there was another question on the amount of debt. But I think we'll go back. I will answer that gentleman's question. The answer is that this government has the largest majority in the history of the Irish state. So they have a majority of about 65 or 70 seats out of 165 or 6. So they definitely have a majority. The question is if the coalition stays intact, which it's expected to do, and they will continue to have that if it falls apart. They won't. So, okay, we're going to go back to the audience. So. Okay, your question was on the debt, on the, what?
It depends. It depends on, if you as the Irish voters want to decide to close the gap between what you want and what you have the resources to pay for, then you don't have to borrow. But the Irish voters have said we want X services, and the government is bringing in X minus something in tax revenue, and they close that gap by borrowing. Now, they don't have to borrow any more than we have to borrow. They've chosen as a society to do that, just like we've chosen. However much we all like to pretend it's the politicians' fault. Politicians do by and large what gets them elected.
But they're not getting that for free. They got to pay that money back with interest. So they'd be better off not going into debt but have government services. They'd be better off cutting back on services.
Can I just go in on that one? I think it's an important issue. It's an important issue from the point of view of, can you suddenly stop the flow of credit into any economic organisation, and yet that the organisation can continue to function? And you're seeing that right across this country. Everywhere you have a small business trying to get a loan just to keep going. Nothing wrong with the business. They just need a little bit of extra liquidity to keep going. But if the borrowing dries up totally, then you don't have the ability to keep the machine going. You can't just keep what is necessary going. And this country, the entire Western world, has been developing over the last decades on the basis of borrowing to keep your services going, borrowing to keep your investment in infrastructure. Now, there is an impact, there is a result if you go back and all of that, and it's a reversal of everything that the Western world has developed in terms of an economic profile. The issue is question of having excess, unmanageable debt. And the problem that is happening in Ireland is that we came off the back of a property boom, which resulted in an enormous loss of capital within the Irish economy at large. We have houses built all over the country that will never be occupied. They were built on the basis of an expectation that the price of houses would continue to go up and up and up, and there would never be a time when the prices will either stop or go back. I think that is a familiar refrain for this country as well. But in Ireland, it hit us hard, and that has resulted in very significant difficulties in availability of credit within the country just to do the business of the country. So as this,
Although I'm sure the lowest of price, somebody could live in those houses. I mean, if the price falls low enough, some will want.
they're built in places where there are no one.
Okay, we're going to go for some more. We're going to go for some more questions. So lots and lots of hands. So I think we'll try them in the middle. Oh, there is someone around the phone.
This is for Peter, mainly, and John. What kind of tsunami is the dollar collapse going to cause, specifically in Ireland? You've seen Irish people using newspapers for toilet paper. What is the tsunami of the dollar collapse going to cause in Ireland, specifically for Irish people and American Irish?
Okay, we're going to go in the middle of it. If you can take that time.
This question is for Peter as well. I think you just mentioned right now that printing money is the saver's default. And the question I'm going to ask, I know that other than a really, really simple answer, I actually want to understand why you say that, because for the United States, we do have the reserve currency, which is kind of all over the world. So for us, when we print money, we value the dollar, but also throughout the entire world, and not just the United States. In that light, why is it such a bad idea to bail out the banking industry? Because when you bail out the banking industry, it's not free money. The bailouts have been treated as a very legal right. But that money has been paid back, and the Treasury is recouping that money. Rather in the alternative, in the default, it's immediate impact, and I think by your own admission and all of your speeches you mentioned, you could have gone into depression to get over a loss of money to the United States dollar, which would have been worse.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Do we have a microphone on this side? Yeah, we can take a question from that gentleman now.
I have two questions, part one and two. I would like to ask you gentlemen, what kind of platform has the EU been built on, and how does it compare with Western culture, Christian Western culture?
Your question is about the EU?
First question, what kind of platform has the EU been built on?
Okay.
Second, how does it compare with Western culture, Western civilization?
Okay, and that, thank you. And that's a good opportunity for me to add another question that's EU related that I meant to ask earlier, which is just on the impact on the Irish political system of this disagreement with the European Union. I mean, Ireland has had a number of referendums on European treaties. I think it's fair to say that Europe is a slightly more controversial issue today even than it was back then. So what are the main risks in terms of Ireland's relationship with the EU as we look forward over the next 5 years, and how might they be sort of managed, I guess is the question. So Peter, since you're a pretty popular guy here today in terms of questions, we'll start with you.
Well, the question about, I mean, inflating and default aren't the same. Actually, inflating is worse. But from the perspective of the creditor would be indifferent. Let's say if the government inflated and printed money and debased its purchasing power and paid off its bondholders with money that bought half as much as it bought when the loans were originally made. That's basically the same thing as a default where you get 50 cents on the dollar. You're getting back half of your purchasing power. But the problem with defaulting through inflation versus defaulting through a restructuring is that when you default through inflation, you impose losses on people that had nothing to do with the transaction. Everybody that has that currency loses. People that never made a mortgage loan, that just had a CD or had money in a mattress or had cash value in an insurance policy. Everybody loses, and it does more damage to the economy when you debase the currency. So it's far more honest to default, but politicians rarely want to do that because they think, well, they can avoid having to acknowledge the problem by printing money, and then when they print money and prices go up, they blame it on the weather, they blame it on economic growth, they blame it on OPEC, they blame it on China, they blame it on everything but their own printing press. The Federal Reserve is making they're trying to say there's no inflation. They pointed out last week that the cost of printing money has gone up by 50% in the last 3 years. It's now so expensive, they don't want to print the $1 bill anymore. And, and the thing is, it costs more to make it, but it buys a lot less. So if he's not adjusted that the prices are going up even more than 50%. I forgot the other question I was asked. Yeah, I said, well, how will it affect? Look, I believe the dollar's days as a reserve currency are numbered, and I think the global economy will change for the better when the dollar is no longer the reserve. But how will it affect Ireland? I mean, if somebody in Ireland owns a lot of dollars, they're going to be hurt. Their dollars are going to lose value, and they're not going to have as many euros when they go to cash them in, or as much gold, or however they want to measure the value of the dollar. But I think beyond that, it's not going to have that big an impact. The impact of a dollar collapse is going to be here in America because it's going to dramatically reduce our standard of living because Americans are going to have to live within their means. Americans are only going to be able to consume if they can produce. They don't have to produce everything that they consume, but they have to produce something because we won't be able to print money and exchange it for products. If we want to import products, we'll have to export products of equal value. And that's very difficult to do when the factories are gone. And when you have all these taxes and all these regulations that drive up the cost of production in this country. So we're going to have a very severe collapse in our country when the dollar goes. It's not going to be the rest of the world that suffers. In fact, most of the rest of the world will benefit because when Americans stop consuming, there's a lot of resources that will be left for everybody else. The world will have a lot of oil when Americans aren't using so much of it, and there'll be a lot of consumer goods that are produced that if they're not shipped to America, those goods aren't going to disappear. They're just going to be bought by somebody else.
Thank you.
I hesitate to jump into the question of what's going to happen if the US dollar collapses. I think it's an enormously oversimplified question. I think we've been looking at the US and we've been looking at Ireland. I think we actually have to look at the full global economic situation and who's up and who's down. If the US dollar suddenly goes through the trapdoor, but who's up? There's an equilibrium in global economics, and essentially the value of a currency is determined by the value of the goods that are produced and packaged. If you lose the value of the dollar, you're going to have one major impact, and that is inflation that is going to hit the US. That isn't going to stay within the US. You can have ripple effects right across the globe. It's not just going to be little Ireland that will be affected. It'll be the relationship between the EU, the euro, the US and the dollar, China, you name it. So there will be a major global upheaval in terms of the economies, who can pay for what, and how do you manage this sort of issue. I would hesitate to try and point the finger as to which direction we will go. There was a question of the platform on which the EU was built compared with Western civilization. That's a rather complicated question. The most complicated part of it is the second part, and that is to compare it with Western civilization. There are more than economists. If you put two economists in the room, you end up with three viewpoints. But in terms of Western civilization, where does the EU stand? I think the best approach I could take in that is to try and point to what was the original thrust behind the establishment of the EU. And you went back to post-World War II efforts to build consolidation and build a solid conflict-free zone for Europe. And it developed from there. And where we are at the moment is that we have redrawn post-World War II political boundaries. We have peace in our continent for a longer period than ever in the history of the continent. We have had progress in terms of acceptance of common standards of operation, of common legal standards, of common procedures of dealing with conflict. All of these are just part of the fundamental political underpinning that is in the EU. But in terms of what is it based on, is the foundation secure? I think the foundation is secure, and if you look to the tradition that, or what has been happening within Europe, that it has developed. There's a constant pressure to develop the number of people that the countries that are in the EU. It started off at 6. It started off essentially as being a trade organization. It has moved from there into political union and economic union. Now, I'd have to say that none of these issues are easy. None of them are easy. And indeed, there have been many difficulties encountered along the way. But what has happened is consolidation of effort and the strategic views that were held, and you would have to point to post-war Germany and France in their efforts to bring about this sphere of calm and conflict-free zone within Europe with economic progress at its heart. I think the foundation is right. I think it is very comparable with any measure that you might bring to bear in reference to Western civilization.
Thank you, John. I would just like to say about the European Union that it is a powerful, massive bureaucracy and institution. And like many institutions, it does, as Martin says very well, in terms of geopolitical issues. But for the ordinary person, it tends to be distant and inhuman in many ways. And one of the problems, I think, with Ireland is that just as we were hit with a double whammy, if you like. The economic downturn coincided with the problem with the Catholic Church, the loss of importance, of deference, of regard for the Catholic Church. As we know, faith begins among the ordinary people, and then the institution comes to manage that faith, and the institution takes over the faith from the ordinary people. The institution gets so big that faith loses its importance, people lose their faith, then the institution collapses, and then you have to start all over again, spreading the good news. And that's what's needed in Ireland today. Some of the non-bureaucratic, non-institutional means of binding the community together. I was in Donegal this summer, and some of you may know there was a famous priest up there, Father McDyer, who went to work among the Donegal Irish in London during the 1940s and 50s. And he met many young Irish people who had emigrated from Donegal, one of the poorest counties in Ireland, and most of them didn't want to be there. And he became convinced that emigration is okay, there's nothing wrong with it if people want to go, want to leave, pursue their interests abroad, but people shouldn't be forced to go and do that. And he came back to Ireland. He was appointed to the parish of Glencullengill. He started a cooperative movement. He was called a communist. He started a vegetable factory, a hotel, a tourist village. He introduced new methods of farming that the locals could farm up the side of hills using the right fertilizer, areas that was just good for sheep in the path and so on, and saved a whole generation. If you go to Donegal, go to Glencullenkill. There's a whole generation that live there, have married there, have their children, and it's a vibrant, culturally rich community. Over the hill, there's a little place called Pert, where there was no Father McDire. It's called a famine village. People left there in the 40s and 50s, never came back. It's completely deserted. Now, it was his centenarian's birth this year, and there was a lecture on him and his life. I attended it, and an old man at the lecture said to me, he said, people like Father McDire, they didn't do it for themselves, they did it for Ireland. And the bankers and the Gambine men and the builders and the developers, they didn't do it for Ireland, they did it for themselves, and not one of them has been punished for it.
Thank you, John. We're just about out of time, unfortunately. Since we skipped over David on this round, I wanted to give you this last word to make any first or final comments.
Sure. We've talked a lot today about various economic and financial indicators, and I think it's worth bearing in mind all these things are proxies for larger issues. And in every society, it comes down to what kind of country you want to have, what kind of society you want to build. And when you talk about the path ahead, it helps to know where you're trying to go. And in Ireland's case, it comes down to this issue of whether Ireland is going to follow what's the shorthand is Boston versus Berlin. Will Ireland be more of a US-style society or more of a European-style society? And over the years of the Celtic Tiger boom and the more recent credit bubble, Ireland was able to sort of avoid that choice. They were able to have the generous social safety net of a European social welfare state while maintaining the very low personal income tax rates of the US free market model. Mary Harney, who was Taoiseach at the time, gave a speech very famously or infamously in the year 2000 where she said people said we'd have to choose. They said we couldn't have it both. We couldn't have an aggressive, successful, market-oriented system and yet maintain our social protections. And she said they were wrong. We didn't have to choose. We can have it all. And about 5 minutes later, things went off the rails. So Ireland, like everyone else, does have to choose. And I think going forward now with this new government, that's the most fundamental choice they face. At the end of the day, deficits and all these other financial metrics are just a thermometer. It's a way of looking at what's happening in a society. Ireland needs to make a choice, it needs to close the gap between its ambitions and its resources, and when it does that, then it can proceed down the road.
Thank you. I'd like to hand it back now to Tim.
I want everybody to give these guys a hand. Thanks to all of you for coming here this afternoon. I want to point out that both David and Peter will be selling books and signing books in the hallway. There was a question earlier about whether Peter's new book, or one of his new books, the new book of Little Book of Bull Moves and Bear Markets would be available. It is available. So just to clarify on that. Also, for those of you who haven't been to the Irish American Heritage Center before, this is physically the largest Irish cultural center in the United States, and there's a lot available around the building. If you want to take some time to check out our library, our museum, our art gallery, our 100-seat black box theater, and everything else, it's all available to you. And Peter will be sticking around to do a talk on the principles of overseas investment starting in about half an hour. Thanks, everybody.